Hello, and welcome once again to another episode of Interesting Stories in the History of Diagnostics. This is Mickey Erday for Halteres Associates. And today, I'm going to talk about why some diagnostics companies fail while others are successful. What are the things that occur that make one successful and another not? We've studied this for quite a while, and I'm going to try to share a lot of the learning with you. This all started almost a decade ago now when we were doing some work with the Gates Foundation, and one of the companies we were helping them with suddenly went out of business. And they asked, why did this happen? How did this happen? They thought this company was doing extraordinarily well, and suddenly they're gone. So we thought about this a bit and decided to propose a particular study to them, which we did, and they accepted. And that had to do with trying to study a number of different companies, some of which we thought were successes, and to find why that would be, versus companies that were actually failures. They went out of business. And the third category is what we referred to as zombies. We thought they were the Walking Dead. We believed that they had already made a mistake that was going to cause them to go out of business down the road. So I'm going to talk about these studies, but I'm not going to go through the level of detail I have before. If you'd like to know more, look at our video description notes, and you'll see both a publication that came out in 2020 on this that we wrote, and then secondly, a presentation I gave on this subject a while ago. So for the project for the Gates Foundation, we investigated 28 companies, and we had them in three different categories. The first category was successes. These were companies that we selected that we believed had been successful over a minimum of 3-year period. They're commercializing the product, they're successfully increasing their sales. And for most of the companies, we were looking at companies that had been doing this much longer than 3 years. So truly, we believe those to be successes. Another form was failures. There were 14 companies who looked in that category. Those were companies that had, in one way or another, failed at some point in the progression towards a successful company, where either early on they failed or perhaps later they failed. I'll go into the details of that. The third type of company that we were looking at is what we referred to as zombies. And the reason for that is that we felt these companies had made a critical error already that simply hadn't resulted in them closing the company yet. But we wanted to look at them longer term after the project was completed in 2015 and determine whether or not they were going to go out of business. So for this project, we selected companies that we knew quite a bit about. We knew about them because we had worked with them, we knew employees, we knew the management, or we knew investors in it. So we had a lot of inside information. And for that reason and others, we didn't divulge who these companies were in these categories, especially the zombie companies, because we predicted they were going to go out of business. And as you'll see, they actually did. So our assessment was based on first coming up with some descriptions of the phases of product development. Now, there are many different ways to do this, but this is something we came up together with the Gates Foundation people that we thought was particularly useful. And I think it was in terms of our being able to look at different stages of a company, understanding how well they've done. So the first category we referred to as phase 0. And that's really because this is a lot of investigation and not any actual work in a laboratory or anything else. So this is what we referred to as the concept and design phase. This is to look at things such as the intended use of the technology, and that's defined during this phase. We define use cases, voice of customer. I'm going to come back to these things after I talk about the study, because I want to tell you about the things that were done particularly well or not so well within each of these categories. But there's a place where you look at market size, competition, intellectual property landscape. And the intent is to have at the end of this phase a target product profile, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, but basically it's a miniature version of a market requirements document. And this defines the product that you're going to deliver in terms of intended use, who's going to use it, the population to be tested, and where it's going to be done. So at the end of that phase, you're going to have this target product profile that you can take to the next phase, which we refer to as feasibility and planning, phase 1. In this phase, you're going to take that target product profile and turn it into actual product requirements. The target product profile doesn't have a lot of technology in it. It has, what the market requirements are, turnaround time, sensitivity, specificity, those kind of things. Now, in this phase, you're defining how you're going to use your technology in order to satisfy that unmet need. So that turns into a product specification profile. And the intent in this particular phase is to make sure that you can develop a prototype, something that is going to perform close to what you defined in a target profile, but it's not formally under product development. It is still actually a research phase, but you're taking it to a point where it's going to be close to the specifications required in the TPP. I'm going to talk much more about that in a few moments. The next phase, phase two, is design and development. And in this particular phase, you're now going to take that prototype and you're going to turn it into a full-fledged product. You're going to go through quality management, you're going to go through design control, all those things. So at the end of this particular phase, you're going to have a product which is manufacturable and which performs to at least the minimum specifications of the TPP. Phase three, we refer to as validation and launch readiness. This means that at this point, the manufacturing process is complete. This may not be the full scalable version of it, but it's the early phase where you're going to be able to make enough kits and you're going to be able to make enough instruments and software so you can go to clinical trials. You're going to do clinical trials for formal regulatory submissions, but also you're going to need to do clinical utility studies. And I'll talk more about this in a little while as well. In phase four is full-fledged commercialization. You're on the market, or you or your partners are on the market. You're actually selling the product and you're getting paid for it, or you're trying to get paid for it. And I'm going to come back to that as well. So those are the major phases. I'm going to briefly talk about where these successes and failures occurred within them, and then about the best practices and problems within each of those phases. So in the talk and the publication I mentioned earlier, you'll find a significant table that has all 28 companies within it, all the different things that can happen in the 4 different phases, and then a description of the things that went well and not so well for each of those companies. And the thing I want to try to point out at this point is where those companies succeeded or failed. The successes, and we had 6 companies in that category, generally did everything quite well. In fact, there were only a few places where some of them had made minor errors, but not things that were going to cause the company to ultimately fail. And a number of them actually did everything right all the way through, which was obviously part of the reason for the success. Failures, on the other hand, failed in a number of different places. They tend to fail at both ends of the spectrum here. Most of those companies, in fact, 70% of them, failed in that phase 0, the concept phase. They didn't design the right product. Or a smaller number of them, about 10% of them, actually failed in the next phase, phase 1, where they tried to develop a prototype, but the prototype just didn't work, or just at the end of the day couldn't perform the minimum requirements of the TPP. That was a big part of that. The zombies are interesting because about 40%, as opposed to 70% of the failures, about 40% of the zombies we felt were going to go out of business because they didn't do phase 0 properly. They didn't design the right thing for the marketplace. They didn't understand exactly what the product was going to have to do. But 60% of them actually failed way out at the end when they were trying to get paid. They never had a feasible strategy for long-term payment for their product. It's hard to believe, but a number of those companies were a decade or more old before they actually ran into that problem. It's astonishing that they were able to raise enough money, keep this going, and then it didn't work. So that's a major problem. And that was the major reason that we had identified those particular companies as potential failures. And just so you know, there were 8 companies in that category. And by the end of 2020, 7 of those 8 had gone out of business. So only 1 remains, and actually they're doing pretty well. But the other companies are no longer with us. So we think that the things that I'm going to tell you about that we identified back then as to why companies did fail and why companies we felt were going to go out of business, we think we did a pretty good job of that, given that we were able to predict that many. So I'm going to go through now then some of the things that were learned. And I'm going to spend most of my time in phase 0 and phase 1, because that's where most of them failed. I will talk a bit about the reimbursement and payment all the way through, because in fact, you've got to do the work up front in phase 0 and phase 1 to know whether or not it's likely you're going to get paid, instead of getting all the way out there and finding you were wrong. So lessons to be learned there. So let's begin with phase zero, concept phase. And here you're probably going to be in a situation, if you're a startup, where you need to raise a small amount of money to get through this concept phase. You might have money yourself, you might have friends and family that are willing to put all the money in, but you're going to need to involve people beyond just yourself. And you often, it may be people who are potential employees who are willing to work in their extra time on this. It might be something for consultants like us, but somehow you're going to need to get the right kind of people around the table to work through these issues. And this is one of these issues, what I would call it, measure twice, cut once. You really have to do a good job in this phase zero in order to be sure that you're on the right path to creating something that the market wants and needs. They may not even know it yet, and then also that you can find a way to get paid. So at this point, you're going to be talking through with your colleagues and with experts in the field, what it is you want to do, who will benefit and who will lose, because somebody's probably going to lose when you introduce this, who will pay for it, and what the end goals are. I mean, what is the reason that this is going to be on the market? Are you going to improve healthcare for patients? I sure hope so. We're going to have to actually prove that down the road, and I'll come back to that. But you're going to need to have something that is competitive and solves unmet needs. So you probably have a pretty clear idea in mind about what you want to do, but now the question is, who needs it? Who wants it? So do you really understand the use case for it? And this would be, I think I mentioned briefly before, the intended use. What do you define as the way in which it will be used? Are you going to determine someone's infected with HIV? You're going to determine which drug they should get if they have cancer. What specifically you're going to do? And what is the setting that this will be used in? Are we talking about a laboratory, a central laboratory? Are we talking about a point of care system like a pharmacy retail laboratory? Who's going to use the test? Is it going to be a laboratorian? Is it going to be somebody who is untrained? Is it going to be a home test where it has to be a fully untrained user? We need to know what population is going to be tested. Who's coming in? If it's a pharmacy retail clinic, is it a person who has no other form of primary care and they're going to use that facility instead? Is it a soccer mom bringing their kid in who's got a sore throat? I mean, who is it that you're expecting to be there and who's going to be tested? And very importantly is an understanding of the full ecosystem in which this test is going to be used. So give you an example of this. There was a study we did some years ago, actually for the Gates Foundation as well, in Africa, where we were going to various clinics and we're looking at some of the tests that they were performing and made a lot of notes and did a large report on this. But I remember at one point we were looking at these CD4 assays that were being offered. They were supposed to be random access systems. That is, you can put one sample on, you get a result, and then you put another sample on. And we noticed a very strange thing, which was that they were not being run that way. People were waiting until they had approximately 10 total samples, then they started processing them. What the heck? What's going on here? It ended up that the other tests that the physicians were offering at the same time for the same patients, these were HIV patients, all were in batch mode. They did run typically 10 at a time. So there's no advantage of doing these random access assays because in the context of the overall ecosystem, until all of them are random access, they're going to run them as batch. So that was really rather eye-opening. And those are the kind of things you just don't know about. You need to understand whether the place that's going to be tested has the right kinds of people. Is it going to take laboratorians? Are there any there? Are they going to have to change the tasks which are assigned to particular people? For instance, we've done some work on TB testing in a number of different locations in Africa, India, and other places. And interestingly, they want to be able to do test and treat the same day. Some of the issues that come up are things such as, well, often the treatment is only conducted certain days of the week in those clinics. So are you going to just test on those days? And other issues have to do with the fact that the doctors order the test. And they typically will have to order it, send the person to the laboratory, get their sample taken, then they have to see the doctor a second time. It takes too much time. Can you do something else where someone else actually is permitted to order the test and send the patient there before they see the doctor the first time? Those kind of things are really very common, not just in low to middle income country situations, but in these point of care clinics as well. So you just have to be very, very clear about what it is the overall ecosystem is, and whether the thing you're going to introduce there needs to have other changes occur before your new tool is going to be useful. You need to make sure that you understand the customer's business model too. For instance, a number of people we know that have been developing these point of care molecular diagnostic tests for SARS-CoV-2 and now flu and STIs and other things, they want to be able to go to places like urgent care clinics. Well, urgent care clinics have a business model where they get those people in and out within 15 to 20 minutes. If you've got an hour test, it's just not going to fit there. They just are not going to stick around that long, and basically just doesn't fit with the business model. How are you going to fit in with the business model that they have? A number of people actually have very specific notions of what the technology needs to do before they actually look at the unmet needs. And this is left to right thinking, in contrast to what we like to refer to as right to left thinking, where you think about the market requirements first and get into the technology second. Target product profiles do not require technology within them. They are unmet needs that the technology needs to serve. You got to make sure that you're not fitting a square peg in a round hole. This happens all the time, and a lot of those failures that I mentioned, they were doing that. They had a preconceived notion of what it was. They tried to force fit it into a market that didn't need what they had. So you are in a situation where you once you understand what that TPP is, got to be thinking about how you're going to get paid for it. Exactly where does the money come from? Is it formal reimbursement like we have in the United States with third-party payers or with CMS? Is it self-pay? And more, there have been a lot of successes with self-pay from patients, such as companies that have the patient collect a sample at home and send it into a laboratory to be performed. That's all out of pocket. Is it in public health? So that it's a different source of funding, either in the United States or a lot of the testing being done in Africa and South America and other places. It's in public facilities of one kind or another, public clinics, and there are sometimes, but usually aren't copays for the patients. It may seem early for this, but you really need to think about the clinical trials that are going to have to be conducted as well. What kind of regulatory authorities you're going to have to go through? FDA, or if you're going to have a CLIA laboratory, you're going to have to go through CLIA, laboratory developed tests, which many people do here in the US. And then for international, are there local requirements in particular countries, or can you go through the WHO and its pre-qualification process? So what are the requirements of that? And are you going to be on the right path for that? It takes a long time sometimes to get samples and or to set up sites. If you're confident enough in what you're doing, you might want to start that relatively quickly. I'll come back to this again a little bit later, but it takes longer than most people realize. And there's a regulatory processes, but you're going to have to think about also studies you're going to do with thought leaders, studies you're going to have to do to develop clinical utility evidence, which is extremely important. I'll come back to that too. So you really should be thinking about what your business model is too, what it is that you want to do. What do you intend will be your exit strategy? Are you going to take this all the way through to a fully integrated company and just try to continue to be profitable, and maybe someday your company be bought by others, but you're on the path where you're going to be the ones who actually take it all the way through to selling to the customer? Or do you want to take it to a certain level and now find a strategic partner of one kind or another that will take it over for you? You want to understand that up front. In fact, you want to think about all the ways in which you're going to have to raise money in order to be successful at the end of whatever your exit strategy is. You got to do that right up front. It's so important. And you need to be thinking here about what kind of team you have to put together. Because in the next phase, we're going to start actually doing some work. You're going to start building an organization, and you need to know which particular expertises are required to be there at that time, which can be done with full-time employees, but it can also be done with consultants. In fact, we had a situation a couple of years ago where we were delivering consultants to play almost every single part in the company for this first couple of years because it made sense for them. But then over time, you replace those people with full-time employees. So at this point, then you've got your TPP and you think that you're on the path for something that can be fulfilling unmet needs and also get paid for. And then you're going to take it on to the next step, which would be phase one. But this may also be a place where you say to yourself and your colleagues, well, this isn't going to work. It's time to cut bait. We don't have something that's likely to work, and just really ask yourself whether or not you are or you are not on the path to move forward. Because again, this is where many companies failed. Sometimes they didn't realize they failed for a while yet, but they actually failed right here because it was not designed for the unmet need. So in phase one, feasibility and planning, we're now going to get to a point where we're going to make sure we understand exactly what we need to make beyond marketing requirements now, product specs themselves, and then we're going to actually go through the process of creating a prototype. So in this early phase here, where you're coming up with the product specifications, you need to have the right people in the room. At least you need to have research and development people. You need to have marketing people or people who understand the market deeply, and regulatory, at least those three. You might want to have manufacturing experts present and other things as well, but let's just stick with at least those, because you're going to have some very tough conversations about the TPP and what it's going to take to get there. Now, TPP is normally separated into minimal requirements, or acceptable, the things that are absolutely necessary for the product to be marketable. Everything in that minimum column needs to be satisfied, or you don't have a product. But normally there is an optimal column as well, which would be things that you'd like to have, but not so sure you're going to be able to do within a reasonable time frame or budget. So there's always this conversation that goes on between the market side and the R&D side, which is the trade-offs. So someone says, marketing says in their optimal, they'd like to have a 5-minute assay. And R&D says, well, okay, that'll take us 5 years and X millions of dollars, but we can give you 20 minutes in 1 year and much less money. What do you want to do? Well, if that alternative, which is not as attractive to marketing, is within that minimal category, then it should be all right. It doesn't mean you won't have a lot of arguments about it, but it should be all right. But what often happens is people are trying to back off of the minimum. And you just can't do that. If you're confident that minimum was needed, if you really do have to have a 5-minute assay and you can't get it in a reasonable period of time, maybe you're not doing the right thing and you should just cut bait here as well. So you got to get to the point where those product specifications, your ability to get to them in a reasonable period of time and reasonable cost is agreed upon. Large companies often have these skill sets internally, but you might be surprised by how many of them actually don't do all that well. And then on the other hand, startups often have difficulty with this. In a startup, there's no time for anyone to learn a new job. You have to have people that have already done this. I just can't stress that highly enough. You might get lucky and somebody's never done it before does a great job with it, but you're just taking a big risk, and investors are not going to be too happy about that. You actually shouldn't be either. But when you're having this conversation with people, it should be with people who understand this very well because they probably did something close to it before. That's not to be confused with saying we did it this way before, we should do it this way going forward, because that often isn't going to be the case. You need to think it through from the start, just like the first time, whoever that was that did it, make sure that the environment now is understood and that you're doing things that are consistent with the way things work today, not the way they used to work. At the end of the day, you need to understand what you think the minimum viable product is going to be. And that's what you're going to start working on now. And now for the first time, you're picking up the pipettes or the wrench or whatever it is you need to do the work to start developing this prototype. By the way, this is a place that is this phase one. There's often a place where your Series A funding is going to get you. That is to the end of the prototype. You've got the prototype ready to go into formal development in the next phase, but that's a convenient place we find with lots of companies to talk to investors about getting to the functional prototype. And now, just to be sure, that is not something that's necessarily manufacturable and not necessarily new materials. Maybe you use somebody else's instrument as a detector, somebody else's as a heater, or whatever you require for this. But the prototype you've developed is closely comparable to the TPP. Often it's not exact. For instance, you need to have in the TPP 90% specificity, and you're only at 85. But everyone around the table says, we know how to get there. We just aren't quite there yet. We can get that in development. That's judgment call, and that's something that's extremely important to go through together and be confident as a team that you actually can get to the next step. But we're not designed for manufacturability yet. That's going to be in the next section. When I was at Chiron years ago, my boss at the time, Pablo Valenzuela, anybody working in diagnostics, he would say, show me the prototype. And until we did, there was no way he was going to believe we even knew what we were doing. So would always like to walk in there with our prototype for him, and then he'd either say, forget it, or he'd say, okay, I'm on board. Investors will do exactly the same thing. One thing many people do in this circumstance, this prototyping, is they don't think clearly about the actual samples they need to use. And they sometimes just try to come up with mock samples. Mock samples, what do we mean by that? It's not the real thing. For instance, in TB, people use sputum usually. Well, that's changing now. But sputum is hard to get, and a lot of people use mock sputum, something that is commercially available that they think is close to it. And maybe they don't want to work with MTB itself because, in fact, it's a dangerous pathogen and has to be used under appropriate biosafety conditions. And you may not have access to something like that. So at the end of the day, what people have is mock sputum with something like BCG that replaces MTB, not all that close. And they go, hallelujah, fantastic, we've got something that works. Well, they should have done the last experiment first. They should have done the MTB real clinical samples. I would always start with that. If you get lucky, it works right away. But if not, even if you do that mock thing, you better make sure that before you declare success, you can use real samples, or it's just not worth moving forward. Okay, at the end of phase one, you have gotten past most of the things that led to all those 70% of failures in the failure companies we identified, but you might not know it yet. And if you've done this well, you're ready to move on to formal assay development. Okay, so now we're in formal design and development. And one of the first things that's very important here is to have a quality management system in place, the so-called QMS. Now, this is defined under ISO 13485, if we're familiar with that. So let me just read this to you. ISO 13485 was written to support medical device manufacturers in designing a QMS that establishes and maintains the effectiveness of their processes. It ensures a consistent design, development, production, installation, and delivery through to disposal of medical devices that are safe for their intended purpose. Right? This scares people half to death who've never done this before, but it's not that terrible. In fact, when you look at it, it's all very logical, but you're putting in place a system in which to manage what you're doing all the way through to supporting customers. And you don't have to do everything up front, but you have to be on the right path to get this done. You at minimum need to do the things that permit you to work under design control and product development. Really, really important. And many times people move ahead before they're ready for this, and they've made a big mistake. The opposite is true as well. We've seen plenty of times when people actually put this in place before they need it. They do this during the prototype phase. It's completely crazy because one of the things you've got to do is document very well any changes you're making through that process. Well, in the early phase with the prototype, you're making so many changes that you don't want to go through this. So I recall we evaluated a test several years ago at a place where they had done this. They put the whole system in place to go through design control way too early. It was killing them. They were years behind, and it was not going to happen. It was simply not ever going to work because they just did too much upfront that wasn't necessary yet. So a lot of companies make the mistake here of trying to get an employee who's never done it before to develop the QMS. Maybe they get a consultant or two, whatever. But you really want to make sure that people have done this before. If it's not an employee, then you need to have a consultant who's got enough time to help you with this. People can help you with software. There are a number of companies out there that have QMS software that you can use, and then you fill in templates. Make sure you use the right one because some of them just don't work very well. But this has to be done well. I just can't stress enough how important that is. So now, in this situation, you're going through the transfer of the prototype capability into this formal product development, and now it's got to be designed for manufacturability. You've got to be able to make what you're developing. And I can't tell you how many times we've seen this be a problem as well. So, for instance, I mentioned that company early on that the Gates Foundation was supporting and went out of business. One of the major reasons was they had developed something that they had tested in the field. It worked very nicely as a prototype, and they had never talked to somebody who manufactures such products before. We actually were helping them connect with manufacturers. So we brought some in, they took a look at it, they said, oh, that's really cool, but you can't manufacture that. And here are the reasons why. Tolerances of the edges on some of their materials. There are lots of things like this where the materials they were using probably weren't going to be manufacturable at scale. They should have done the homework way before that, but it eventually caused them to go out of business. The investors were not willing to spend the money to go back over to phase zero and move through it again. Just wasn't going to happen. Remember that this phase, you've got to meet the minimum TPP requirements, or it's a no-go. That's just got to be the rule. You can't play around and say, well, maybe we can use the cost of goods that's 3 times higher. Don't fool yourself. Sometimes you just have to say it's not going to work. I've seen this so many times where people change the goals because they can't meet the TPP. That is crazy. It's just crazy. Or they assume it will be solved later, that a miracle happens down the road. Nobody knows how that's going to happen. For instance, this happens often in the cost of goods, where they will say, yeah, well, it's $10 today, but we can get it to $1 in a couple of years, I think. You really need to be pretty clear on how that's going to happen. Are the material costs going to come down as you get to those scales, or what's going to happen that makes that possible? You really have to be quite clear about that, or you're wasting your time and money. In fact, you're just postponing a future failure. Some of the failures we saw. That's all you're doing if you fool yourself that way. That's also a good time to look at your intellectual property. Do you have the freedom to operate with what you're doing? Usually people will have initiated the intellectual property sometime before this. A lot of startup companies in particular, this comes out of academia. They often help you with IP. But you have to be very careful about how this is all done, because it's commonly the case that people can get a claim, but they haven't thought it through far enough to be able to support their business down the road. And the people who are really savvy, they get intellectual property attorneys who understand the actual litigation of patents as well, because they may come up with a rather different way of thinking about how to construct claims. I can remember having a conversation like this with a very good attorney, who said, well, look, if we construct the claim that way, the judge on this circuit court is likely to look at it. She's a chemist and she thinks like a chemist. And if you construct the claim this way, she's probably going to let it stand. If you construct it this way, she's not. So, you have to be talking to the right kind of people to be able to have a conversation like that. And it's very important that you do. So once you're confident that the product will meet the TPP, you get clinical trial sites together, or you find retrospective samples you can use that would be acceptable in these regulatory studies. Now you're ready to start really thinking through and beginning the process towards clinical trials, which is going to be in the next phase. But you need to think about this ahead of time, have sites ready, get samples where you can. Maybe you'll get away with retrospective samples only, which is sometimes the case, because if you're showing equivalent to something else, that can take a long time. I've seen it take 1 to 2 years in some cases. So really make sure you understand where that's all going to happen down the road, so you can be prepared once you've met the TPP. It's a manufacturable product, and you want to take it to the next step. So now we're getting to phase 3. So in phase 3, this is the validation and launch readiness. And so you've got the manufactured product. You are able to make the tests, the software, the instruments. These are manufactured products that you do not expect to have to change over the course of the trials you're about to get into, because if you do, you may have to resubmit. So that's really not what you want to do. There can't be prototypes. We're way past that. No changes, ready to submit. So now the major focus of this is going to be the regulatory submission and getting to clinical trials. If you have something which is got a precedent, you're able to do comparative studies, that's great. You probably don't have to do anything prospectively. But if you have something new and rather different from others, then you're almost certainly going to have to do prospective studies. Sometimes you can get away with retrospective prospective studies, but somehow or another, you're going to have to do fairly substantial amount of clinical work in order to show that this works. And you can't underestimate how much it's going to cost. It's surprising to people sometimes. These trials can be many tens of millions of dollars, or even over $100 million, depending on what it is. This is something you have to have thought about much earlier than this. This may be a place where you've now found yourself a strategic partner and they're going to take it on from here. But someone is going to have to foot the bill, do the work in order to move through the regulatory submission. You're also in a situation where you're going to have to start putting together all of the other materials that are necessary for submission to do with your design history and all the other aspects of things that you've been monitoring all along here. So it's quite a lot to take on. Some companies will put in place a regulatory organization to do this and have everybody in-house. That's usually larger companies. Or if you think you're going to have enough products that's worth your while, or you're going to work with consultants, you're going to work with contract research organizations, somehow get help that you may not need again from outside organizations, so you don't have to hire employees. But it can still be even more expensive to do it that way. But that expense of those people goes away once you're done with that. So as I mentioned earlier, beyond simply regulatory submissions, and that depends on what market you're going to, is it FDA, is it CE mark, is it WHO PQ for little middle income countries? What are you going to have to do? Is it CLIA for your CLIA laboratory? But going down that path, there are other things you got to do in the study area as well. You almost certainly going to have to do work with thought leaders in the area, do studies with them, do publications. Publications that come just from the company itself usually are not very well received. May have an initial publication in that way, but you're going to have to get other people who are known in the field to support this and say, yep, I ran it and it works for me too. This can get a bit crazy. For instance, way back when I was at Chiron and we were working on hepatitis C, I swear we did so many studies. We'd go to different regions of the country and there are different thought leaders there. In that particular case, those tended to be very high-level infectious disease docs who had practices to deal with something like hepatitis C and other major hepatitis-associated ailments, and people would be referred to them. So they wanted to be shown to be expert in it, and often meant doing a study with them, publishing that, and showing that it worked in their population as well as others we've looked at. It can get ridiculous. We went to Europe, and we found in some countries like France, we needed to work with 3 thought leaders. In Italy, it was 20. It was just crazy. So depending on what the market is and what the thought leader network is like, who are on the guideline committees, you're going to have to do work with many of them to get them to actually use the product down the road and also to promote the product, usually on their own behalf, but talking at meetings, but the company benefits from that as well. And the one that a lot of people don't remember to do, I mentioned earlier, is clinical utility studies. So clinical utility being 2 things. One, does a physician change the practice of medicine? And second, does it make a difference in the outcomes of the patients? So the first part nowadays is much easier than it used to be, because you can actually do a lot of this online. For instance, the group Cure that we work with here in the Bay Area, QURE, they do online vignettes of patients that you can present to a large number of physicians, and the physician can look at the way they would behave with a particular clinical presentation without this new tool, and then does that change if they have the new information in the same type of patient? And you can measure that very easily online. It's been compared to random clinical trials. And so, it's a very good way to go and a whole lot less expensive and not quite as long as the traditional way. But when you're looking at outcomes for patients, this is typically going to be a longer process. And it's something you want to do as soon as you can, because many people wait. They do the regulatory submissions. They then do clinical utility later. It takes a very long time. They're not going to get full reimbursement for this until you've been able to show that. And that can be something that just drags on your ability to be paid for a very long time. So just be aware of that. Again, it's an issue of, do you have the confidence early enough that this product is going to be something that's going to be used, that you're willing to spend the time, money, and effort on the clinical utility study. And now we're ready for phase 4. Phase 4 is commercialization. It really is now just the scaling this up selling to more customers, making sure you get paid for it, and all the work that's entailed. And it's a lot of work. And people are always surprised how many salespeople and marketing people are required to get these things done. But believe me, it's not simple. Any of you who've been in it, you know what I mean. You may very well find partnerships that can do this. And again, if you've already transferred this to a commercialization partner, manufacturing partner, they're going to take that on. They may have a commercial organization in place that's just right for this. That's probably the case, or they probably wouldn't have taken on. But if you're creating one yourself for your product, it's a daunting task. Finding people that have done something like it before, know how to deal with this, understand how to come up with the value proposition for their customers is very important. If you're selling to a laboratory, it's completely different if they're selling to physicians. And people just have to understand what that all means. And getting paid. Oftentimes you get paid early because it's under the radar of some of the payers, with third-party payers like we have here in the United States and even CMS. Sometimes they can be paying for it for a while, and then suddenly it comes up a certain financial hurdle, and they look at it and go, wait a minute, who are we paying? What is this for? And you have to be able to be ready for that and not be fooled by that early payment and thinking that that is the same as long-term payment. So tech assessment, coding, coverage, which is very different from the other two, all those things are going to be critical. So again, there aren't that many people that failed in this part of the process. Some did, but this is going to be that issue of, did you set yourself up for long-term payment, not just those under the radar payments? And when you get to a certain point where you're entering the market, that's the average customer, not the early adopter, you're crossing the chasm, as Jeff Moore always says. So this is it's a really difficult time to get through, but it's one where you have to. And many times, if you're even a startup, you need to get somewhere down the road with this and show that you're making good traction here and you have good prospects for continued growth after this. And that may be another place where you can do an IPO or you can sell the company. So all those things have to be thought of ahead of time. Now, if you go to low to middle income countries, it's not all that different in some regards, but you still have to be thinking about who's going to buy the product in the short term for these public markets, which is usually what the global health community is looking for. It's being used in a public health setting, public health clinics throughout many of these countries. And there are, in some cases, catalytic procurers, if you will, groups like Unitaid, who will buy the product early on, and they'll make it available in a variety of locations with the intent of transitioning that to longer-term procurers like the Global Fund, depending on what the disease state is. Then eventually, the ministries of health are going to have to get involved as well, whatever the paying system is within the country. So a lot of those things are the same. And one of the things that's different is that it's often possible to work with the not-for-profit NGOs as your commercialization partner. They're going to help you if it's the right kind of product for the right unmet need to get into that. So there's commercialization issues no matter which market type you're going into. And again, this was a place, even in LMICs, where you can fail after early adoption, just not recognizing that you weren't looking at the standard part of the market, the typical customer. So I hope what I've been able to do is to give you some sense for why certain companies are successful, other companies fail, other companies fail quick, some companies like the zombies fail over the longer term, and the kinds of things that you can look at, particularly in those first two phases, phase 0, phase 1, which is where we saw most of the failures. What are the kind of things you do up front? I spent much less time on phase 2 through 4 purposely, but wanted to give you a sense of that as well. And the fact that you can fail as far out as phase 4 if you haven't figured out exactly how to be paid. Even when you get that early inkling that you're going to be paid, it's just the early adopters. That's a big issue. So I hope that this is a series of lessons that will help you be more successful. I suggest you look at our publication in particular, because you might find some of the questions that we suggest that you ask yourself about where you stand there, and measure yourself with some of the tools that we've developed. Those of you who might be investors, I hope you find that useful as well in looking at some of these companies and asking yourself whether there's someone you want to invest in. I hope the NGOs can find that this is helpful in looking at companies and whether or not they're likely to succeed in the long term, and the kinds of questions one should ask. And I hope this all makes it easier for companies and investors and NGOs to get the right product into the field and avoid the mistakes of the past. Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Interesting Stories in the History of Diagnostics. This is Mick Yearday from Halteres Associates. Thanks so much for watching, and we look forward to bringing another episode real soon. Thanks very much. Bye.